Today on Locked On Red Wings, with free agency seemingly over, is this team any better?
You're Locked On Red Wings, your daily podcast on the Detroit Red Wings. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Red Wings podcast. We are your hosts, Brian Fisher and Scotty Bentley. I'm a former broadcast producer for 97.1 The Ticket, where Scotty's the host over at Locked On Tigers, as well as a freelance journalist for the Detroit News. How about a round of applause for Scotty's Tigers, giving him some positive stuff to talk about. Riley Green, Tarek Skubal, both named to the All-Star game. The first time the Tigers have had two All-Stars since, not counting the Miguel Cabrera year, since what, 2017? Okay, I was going to say 2016. I was a year off. And then, of course, a series sweep since the first time since March. So it's he's got some positive stuff to talk about.
Yeah, this was the most upbeat Locked On Tigers episode we have had in maybe over a month. It was vibes are high for sure.
So go check Scotty for high vibes over at Locked On Tigers. Over here at Locked On Red Wings, however, we're going to be kind of having an expansion on our conversation yesterday, as well as rehashing the conversation we did have prior to the Tarasenko signing that we had to kill because they signed Tarasenko right at the end of that recording, the quote-unquote lost episode. We're going to be having that conversation today about, is this team any better? We're going to go through and break down the new strengths and new weaknesses of each group, and just at the end of the episode, we'll have a final verdict on how we feel about this new roster as it stands right now, because, of course, another move could happen, and as you know, Steve Yzerman showed last offseason, he's very capable of making deals throughout the summer. DeBrincat, Jeff Petrie, then signing Patrick Kane in November. So this doesn't necessarily mean it's the final roster, but as of right now, this is what we're working with, and we can't predict when a trade's going to come. So we'll talk about it. But before we get to any of that, got to let you guys know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down or have wound down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Also want to thank you guys for making Locked On Red Wings your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and, of course, on YouTube. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Scotty, every day. Scotty, I think it's probably wisest if we attack this by group. I mean, 3 segments, 3 groups, forward, defense, and goaltending. Let's start with the forward group when we're having this conversation about, is this team any better? The Red Wings saw a plethora of players leave the team. Daniel Sprong, Robbie Fabry, to name just a couple, and David Perron, obviously. You know, when you're looking at last year's forward group to this year's forward group, where do you feel, or where are you on that spectrum of, is this team any better or worse?
You know, I think this is a really interesting, probably the most interesting place to start when you're breaking down positional groups, because I think this is the highest range of what we could possibly see out of a positional group, right? When we are obsessed here with talking about ceilings and floors, right? That's something we bring up very, very often when analyzing groups and players and teams and whatnot. And I feel like this is kind of the epitome of that, is the forward core. And the reason for that is because of all of the young talent that is going to be injected into the forward core. So I'm really glad we're having this conversation, and it's not going to get ruined at the 30-minute mark, by the way.
Careful.
Yeah, don't want to jinx myself there, but it's just really funny. Like, we had this conversation, but then, you know, we didn't have Tarasenko. So I do think that this is a group that can see a wide range of success. I mean, you talked about it right there. The forward group saw a lot of goals walk out the door, and that's something that Yzerman brought up in the press conference, right? He talked about the fact that a lot of goals left this offseason, but you also have to look at the player profiles individually as well. You know, you look at like Daniel Sprong, for instance. Daniel Sprong was a really good depth goal scorer for this team and did great, especially in the first half of the season in that role. The issue is he was healthy scratched when this team was spiraling. He was getting healthy scratched, right? When this team could not win a game to save their lives, Daniel Sprong was getting healthied because he was such a liability in pretty much every other aspect on the ice, specifically the defensive side of the puck. And you have a few guys that fall into that category that are, again, like left or are, I guess there's a couple, like Berger we can talk about and whatnot. But like there are, with this offseason, you saw goals leave, but you also are going to have youth, presumably 200-foot youth, right, make their debut and be a part of that depth. But I think that it's such an interesting conversation because, yes, your goal scoring and your depth goal scoring specifically probably got worse, but there's also a lot of question marks of like, can DeBrincat bounce back and have a better goal scoring season? How much is Tarasenko going to contribute in goal scoring? How much is a full season of Patrick Kane going to give you goal scoring wise? Can Lucas Raymond take another step forward, right? And then on top of that, you have, the Marco Casper conversation, the Nate Danielson even potentially conversation, Berger, right? Like it's so, the forwards are it's a bleep show, and not in the negative connotation. Like it's just like it could be anything, man. Like they could score less, but they also could be better defensively and score more. Like I don't think that's completely unreasonable or impossible ever as well. So I don't know, man. I guess that's just my long-winded way of saying like I have no clue. Like it could be anything. Like the rest of the positional groups, I have a decent grasp of what I expect out of them this year. The forward group, I don't. Like they could score more, they could score less. And I think the one thing, we brought it up a little bit yesterday, is at a minimum, the forwards are going to be better defensively, right? And I think that is something that raises the floor a little bit of this group. But it also, like, I don't know, what if you have a line with Kane and Tarasenko on it? That's not going to be exactly, that's going to be a heavily protected when it comes to deployments type of line. Like
you sell it for a little bit of offense there.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So it's, I don't know. I really, again, there's 4 minutes of me saying, I don't know.
Well, so just to put some numbers behind what you were saying, right? So Perron scored 17, Sprong scored 18, and Fabry scored 18 goals, respectively. Once you add in Jake Wollman and Goss Despair, and I know I'm cheating a little bit going to the defense, that's another 10 and 12 goals. 75 goals walked out the door or traded away this offseason. That's a significant amount of goals. I mean, that takes you from, top 15 in the league. That could drop you from top 15 in the league to bottom 15 in the league. And so it's one of those situations where, like, they lost a lot of goals, but we also know that this team was a glass cannon, right? This Red Wings team last year was a lot, and I said it a lot during the season, was a lot like the Buffalo Sabres team from the year prior, where they were, for a large part of the season, they were outscoring their problems. And going into them, and it caught up with them,
right?
And,
it wasn't
they
year to year, like mid-year, it caught up with them.
And they missed the playoffs in a very similar fashion to how the Sabres missed the playoffs. The Sabres missed the playoffs by 1 point the year before. Red Wings lost on a tiebreaker. So the Sabres, going into last offseason, did not make any moves to really assess their biggest needs, which was the defensive side of the puck and in net. And I was saying it all offseason. I was like, this team is going to slide because the way they scored was unsustainable, and they're banking on that to continue. And then, of course, injuries did not help. But again, the players that had phenomenal years did not have phenomenal years again, and they slid hard. So Steve Yzerman, I give him a lot of credit for recognizing that they had a problem and trying to address it. That meant goals walking out the door, but this team is better defensively. So obviously getting Tarasenko, who's not a two-way forward by any means, but has a huge offensive punch, and you needed that in the top six, will add 24 goals, 25 goals. He had 24 goals last year between two teams. He's probably going to, I would assuming if he's playing on a line with Patrick Kane and getting good offensive zone deployments, will bury probably another 25 to 30 this year. That goes a long way to replace your offense. Obviously, you have Patrick Kane, who's going to have a full year healthy and training like an athlete. He had, I believe, 20 goals this last year. I wouldn't be surprised if he adds another 5-10 goals this year when he gets a full 82, assuming he can stay healthy. I mean, that's a big question mark. But if he stays healthy, I think you could see 30 goals from Patrick Kane again. Like, he scored 20 goals just getting back from having a major surgery. Imagine what a full offseason of training can do for him. Jonathan Berggren, again, another guy who doesn't have a lot of defensive upside, has a tremendous offensive upside. I think he will replace Daniel Sprong in that depth scoring power play role. I would not be shocked if he adds 15 goals. Gustafsson is another guy you can put on the power play. He's not going to score 10 or 12 goals like Woolman or Gostisbehere did, but he'll give you 6, 7, 8 goals as well. And then if Raymond, I don't want to put too much on Raymond, right? Because he scored, 32 goals this last year, 32 goals this last year. I don't want to be, he's going to be a 40-goal scorer. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I wouldn't be surprised if he can tack on a few more. So I think between those guys... Yeah, expected goals turning into goals, right? Yzerman said it himself.
Cat was like is I don't know, maybe the biggest one to me. Like Cat, we brought him in. We were talking about, can he push 40? Like that was the conversation we had when we brought him in, and like I'm not expecting that necessarily after this past season, but like that's you're talking about adding like 10 plus goals out of one guy if he reaches closer to what we expect out of him too.
Yeah, and then that doesn't even get into what will. Guys like Marco Kasper, Carter Mazur, if they make the team, provide. Right. But here's the issue with everything I just said. What I just said, you can see a route where the offense replaces itself. If Carter Mazur makes the team, we already know Mott and Fisher are with the team. They're going to make this team better defensively. There's no argument this team is better defensively with the players that they signed. Mott is going to make this team so much better defensively on the bottom six. It's going to make the lives of the top six a little bit easier deployment-wise. Christian Fischer, we already know, is a shutdown guy. Andrew Kopp's a shutdown guy. Michael Rasmussen can be used in that role. Defensively, this team is better on the front, on the tops, in the forward group. And that's something that this team really desperately needed. But the problem with the hypothetical offensive replacements is that a lot of it is unproven commodities in that regard, right? Like, we know that Patrick Kane before his surgery could do that. Can he do it now? Well, we're hoping. Will Carter Mazur make the team and have an offensive impact? We're hoping. Same with Marco Kasper and Jonathan Berggren. The only two guys, that we know are proven commodities that will add goals, right? Like, we know Lucas Raymond's a proven commodity, but he was already on the team last year. The only two guys that are proven commodities coming on this team that are going to add goals are Tarasenko and Gustafsson. Everyone else, you're kind of hoping adds goals, and that's where the problem lies. So while it's just as easily arguable that this team could, if everything works out in the right way, could take a step forward or at least stay where they were last year, I think it's easily as arguable that the marginal improvements they made on the defensive side of the puck on offense is not going to be able to replace all the goals they lost if the internal improvements do not come to fruition. And that's what this year is going to be, okay, are the players we retained and are the players that are coming up through the system going to be able to replace that offense in year one? And I'm not sure they do. And I'm not sure if the defensive side of the puck, where we did get better, is going to be enough to then close the gap between the two, right? Like, as much as you need to score, you need to not get scored on. And that's where the real conversation is. So, like I said, I think you could just as easily make an argument that they could and won't be better at the same time.
Yeah,
so
no,
yes, I don't know.
Right. That's there's a lot of there's a wide range of outcomes for so many players, and that makes it, the parity between the top end and the bottom end, right? Like the 80th percentile outcome and the 20th percentile outcome, the best and worst case scenario are so vastly, stretched out, and they're so far apart from each other with this group.
Absolutely. We're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we will talk about the defensive core, and then segment 3, talk about the goaltending. So stay tuned for segment 2 of Locked On Red Wings. Keep getting ahead of myself. Got to talk to you guys today about FanDuel. I love sports, and I never want them to stop. But the Stanley Cup Finals is over. The NBA Finals is over. All we got left until August is baseball. And the All-Star Game's coming up, and the Tigers got 2 All-Stars, which is super exciting because Riley Green and Tarek Skubal are 2 of the best in the game. But with that just being what we got, FanDuel wants to remind you that you can keep the sports going whenever you want. All you have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com right now and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Segment 2, Locked On Red Wings podcast. Scotty and I are talking about whether or not the Red Wings are better. We talked about the forward core, and we got a little bit into the broader team as a whole too. But let's focus in now on the defensive core. You know, Scotty, when it comes to the defensive core, do you think this team will be better than last year?
Yes. Yes. I think that this is one where I'm pretty confident that the blue line has improved. It looks a little different just in terms of strengths and weaknesses, and I think you're also pinning another kind of step forward in production and role, to be honest, from Seider, right? Like he's likely, almost certainly going to move to power play 1. That's going to be a nice step for him as well. But I think that where I stand with the blue line is like this is better, and they are certainly better defensively as well. And hopefully Edvinsson can be a big reason for that. His first full season in the NHL. You have Gustafsson, who we talked about, is going to be a nice addition as well. But like this is a group that I think the question is more so, is it better enough? Right. Like I think it's better, right? The blue line is better than it was last season. It was a huge area for concern. But when you go through, you know, player by player or pair by pair, is it better enough to take that step forward or to justify predicting a step forward from this team? And I think that that's a huge question. I'm not sure that that's a guarantee. I'm not sure that this is, you know what, it might only be our favorite word, marginally better, right? It might not be, you know, a big enough step forward to be able to like get this team over the hump and really, you know, see a ton of increased production or success from the blue line. I think there's a very real chance that it's better, but it's still not very good at the end of the day.
So I'm in agreement with you in one particular area, and that is going to be really obvious when I say it because it's something I've been parroting all offseason long, and that's that the second pair on the right side is a huge hole. Jeff Petrie proved last year, I've kind of been forced to become a Jeff Petrie defender because some people have just been saying some ridiculous things, but I recognize and I will freely admit he's not a top 4 defenseman at this point in his career. I think he'd be a very effective third pair right side D-man, but looking at the construction of this defense, I don't see anyone who's better suited for the second pair than Jeff Petrie still, and that's not a compliment. That is an indictment on this roster, and I will freely admit that they had to address the right side of their D for the second pair, and they failed to do that this offseason. But on the same breath, I can also say with confidence, I think that this is I would almost say a pretty significantly better defensive D-core. And there's one reason for that, and something that we necessarily weren't, when we first looking over all the free agent signings and we were looking at the D-core, I think we overlooked this because this player played so much down the stretch that we kind of forgot about it. We forgot this player wasn't on the team, and that's Simon Edvinsson. Edvinsson only played the last 16 games with the Detroit Red Wings, and he made a huge impact on that second pair. He will now have a full summer to train and get stronger and better when he already looked pretty good in that role and will presumably play a full 82 games with the Detroit Red Wings, again, barring any health issues. It goes without saying. I think Simon Edvinsson is the Red Wings' biggest free agent acquisition. I know he was a draftee, but you understand my point. Like, he will be on this team next year at the start of the season, and he is a huge upgrade on that second pair. And to be honest, as a former 6th overall pick, he needs to be. I don't think it's an unfair expectation to say that Simon Edvinsson has to be a huge upgrade on the second pair. But having Simon Edvinsson on your second pair also makes it so that that second pair can take on a little bit more difficult deployments and make the life of Seider and presumably Sherratt, who looked good with Seider down the stretch when Edvinsson got called up and Woolman was hurt/scratched, better. Like, I think the biggest improvements on the defensive core are actually going to be internals. And I know that he's not, and the argument can be made the same with the offensive core, right? That I was talking about with proven commodities. But Simon Edvinsson, with 16 games played last year, looked like he was ready. And now he's going to have a whole offseason to become more ready for the NHL. And I think he will make this defensive core a hell of a lot better. Like last year going into the season, the second pair as a whole was like, I don't know about it. But now it's like, okay, we have half of a second pair. I know people are hearing that and they're like, that's still not that great. And you're right. That's still not that great, but it is still an improvement as well. And then the third pair, I think, is head and shoulders above the third pair from last year defensively. As much as Gostisbehere provided offensively, he was horrible defensively. They got the most sheltered deployments in the NHL, he and Mata, because you could not put them in the defensive zone. They only got offensive zone deployments against the weakest competition. So just having a defenseman back there in Gustafsson who has an offensive touch and will play power play, he might not have 50 plus points, which obviously that will hurt, not having the 50 plus points, but having a third pair of him and Mata or him and Albert Johansson or Justin Holl. I don't know what's going on with Justin Holl. I'm not even going to think about that, but he's on the roster. Primarily Gustafsson, Ajo, and Mata. Those three are going to be able to take on tougher deployments than the third pair last year, and they're going to make the lives of the two pairs above them a little bit easier because of that, namely Moritz Seider. Now, it still brings me back to the biggest need on defense was the right side, right? They did not address the right side of the second pair. And if you really wanted to make your entire D group better by a large margin, you had to address that. But I still think that this defensive grouping with just the internal addition of Simon Edvinsson and Albert Johansson and the external addition of Erik Gustafsson makes this D core pretty solidly better defensively, even though it lost maybe a little bit of offense. But we still don't know how much offense that Simon Edvinsson is going to provide either. That's still left up in the air. I don't think he's going to have the Moritz Seider 40 to 50 points upside. But if you get 25 to 30 points from Simon Edvinsson, that's pretty significant from a defenseman.
For sure. I think maybe it's just like a more pessimistic view, but like in my eyes, this is the same D-core that we were running with last year, but with the addition of a rookie and a third pair guy, right? Like that's how I view it. And like, that's not an indictment on like a negative viewpoint towards Edvinsson, right? If he goes out and wins the Calder, awesome. Like that's great. Obviously that would be fantastic. And there's a chance that he could have, I don't even know if he's rookie eligible with his sprinkling in of games over the last couple of years. But anyway, you get my point. Like if he shows up and is unbelievably productive off rip, that's great. That's just I understand the high draft pick and whatnot, but that's still just a lot to pin on a rookie in your second pair and then a third pair free agent acquisition. Like that's just a lot to be like, oh, like the defensive core is going to be way better because of those two additions. Like you said, there is still a complete black hole on the other side of Edvinsson. Like he's not going to be able to just do it himself. And I also have serious questions about, like, obviously Mo and Sherratt were, solid in the second half of last season when Woolman went down. But like, we've also seen that pair be terrible. Like the first time they tried it, it was a disaster. Like there's absolutely no guarantee that's good. I don't think Ben Sherratt's a top pair defenseman on a team that is like making a deep playoff push either. Like I think they will be better. No one's I'm not disagreeing with you there. They will absolutely be better. I just think that there's a real possibility it's a lot smaller of an upgrade than like being a massive upgrade. But in the same breath, maybe it only needs to be a slight upgrade. Maybe it doesn't need to be some like, oh my goodness, the blue line is so much better than it was last year. Maybe a marginal upgrade is all they need to get over the hump. I'm not saying the season's like over or anything because of it. I'm not sure that it's a massive upgrade over what we saw last year.
No, that's completely fair. I will not disagree with you because I think it's like with the conversation with the forward group, like it's easily arguable in both ways. Like
sure.
you see how they are better defensively, and you see how there's potential to replicate that offense with internal improvements and a couple of external, but it's also just as easily to say, well, these young kids probably aren't going to wow us in their first year because development continues at the NHL level, and that the marginal defense is not going to close the gap with the goals that they lost. So with that being said, we'll move on to the third group, which makes sense because it's going to be the shortest conversation, I would hope, because we're already at 25 minutes. So stay tuned for that in segment 3 of Locked On Red Wings. Segment 3, Locked On Red Wings podcast. All right, Scotty, goaltending. Now this is weird. This whole thing is weird. They have 4 goalies right now, and I said this on yesterday's episode, I think we're in agreement Jack Campbell's slated to be Grand Rapids goalie, pushing the net with Sebastian Cossa, someone who can just kind of like be like, hey, there's somebody still here, don't get comfortable. But your other 3 goalies are Lyon, Husso, and Cam Talbot. And Yzerman said, and again, you can never really trust Yzerman when he says things in the media, but he says they're going to roll into training camp with those 3, and they're going to see who wins the starts. Scotty, is the goaltending better?
Yes. Yes. I think the addition of Talbot is good. I think that Talbot, even if you're talking about the lower end of what he may produce, is still probably a better and a more consistent upgrade over what Reimer was giving you. But this one is like the epitome of, they're better, but I don't know if they're going to be better enough. I think that this one kind of perfectly epitomizes this group, because you are still going to rely, presumably, on Lyon and on Husso, at least at the time of this recording. We'll see what happens with the goaltender room the rest of the summer, but I don't know. My biggest thing with the goalies is that there is a very real possibility that all 3 of these guys don't have very good years. Like, that's not far-fetched. You don't have to do mental gymnastics to convince yourself that all 3 of these guys are not going to have great years, right? Like Talbot, you have age, you have a worse defense in front of him than what he got last year. Both of those factors, he could take a big step back. Lyon, we got a great year out of last year, but he doesn't done that consistently throughout his NHL career. There's a very real chance that he kind of reverts back to what he has been in his career. And Ville Husso has been good for 2 months as a Detroit Red Wing. Like, was really, really good for the first month or 2 that he was a wing. And besides that, has been around a 900 or even worse save percentage goalie. So like there is Talbot's a good addition. I like the addition. I'm pro the Talbot signing, but there is absolutely no guarantee that any of these 3 guys are like legitimate playoff goalie or a goalie for a playoff team caliber.
Yeah, and I mean, not to further rain on everybody's parade, but you talk about how Husso was good for like 1-2 months of the Detroit Red Wings in his first season. You could say the same about Lyon. I know people remember how incredible he was, but it was really just 1 month, the month of January, where his numbers were unbelievable. February, he had a sub-900 save percentage. As the team struggled, he struggled. March, he continued to go up and down. April, he seemingly got it back together right at the end of the season. But so you have 2 goalies who we've seen glimpses of greatness, but mediocrity outside of that. I think just like with the 4 in the defensive group, it's full of question marks. You could make the argument that it's going to be better because Cam Talbot was a really good goalie last year with the LA Kings. But then you take into account, like you said, his age. He just turned 37. You take into account that the LA Kings faced the 4th fewest shots at 5-on-5 of any team in the NHL last year, so his workload was easier. Of course, to counterpoint that, he still had 15 goals saved above expected, so even in that position, he was performing well. But, when you're getting you're getting shot on more, you would assume that this, right, you'll get scored on more as well. So how much better Will he be with those as a question mark? Will Husso be healthy? And if he is healthy, will he be the upgrade that we thought he was 2 years ago? As this team is actually, as crazy as it sounds, will be better defensively than they were 2 years ago. That's the thing I don't want to make. I want to make sure it's not lost on people.
Wings defense that Husso's ever played behind.
Right. So, like, can he be better now that he's not going to be as shelled as bad? Presumably, that's my word of the day. Is presumably. So it's just one of those situations. Like, you can see the goaltending, and you can see the D core, and you can see the forward core having the potential upside of being better, or at least as good as last year. But you can also see the argument for it not working out. And that's just where you just bank on
Does that sound familiar?
Right.
Does that sound like every positional group we've talked about? Like that's really, and if you want to end on like overall team aspect, right? That's kind of the reoccurring theme here, right? Is you can really easily convince yourself of both. You can convince yourself that this team's going to slide. You can convince yourself that this team has what it takes to take a step forward. You can convince yourself that they're going to plateau and maybe be a similar point total, albeit with a different way of getting there. And I think that is the biggest thing for me, is like it is so important, and this is what you started the show with, so we can kind of go full circle. It is so important that this team is better defensively, and that is going to raise the floor of like, when you talk about bottoming out and like worst case scenario, this raises what that is, like pretty significantly, I think. But the big question is, did they get better enough? Do they have the goal scoring? Do they have enough goals come in that's going to make up for all the goals that walked out? And is the defense good enough? It's going to be better, but no one expects to be the Hurricanes, right? Like it's going to be a really, really, I'm fascinated with this season. I really is. Like I really am. Like this is going to be a really, really fascinating year for a lot of reasons. And I think a lot of it is going to rely on the shoulders of the youth that you are adding to this team and the internal, as you put it, additions that this roster is going to make heading into the fall.
And when it comes to me making a final verdict and not just sitting on the fence and shrugging my shoulders and going, I don't know.
Wow, that's a crazy call out.
I do it all the time. I call myself a fence sitter because I like to play both sides. That way I always come out on top. Always sunny.
Yeah, smart.
But when I'm trying to make a conclusion with the final verdict, I think about when I sat here, or I guess sat 10 feet back there last season.
Different setup.
Different setup. And I think to myself, last year there was never a doubt in my mind that this team was better. Because of the free agent acquisitions that they made, there was no question in my mind they were going to be better. They were also 10, 11 points worse last year as well. 80 points, and the acquisitions they made, it was pretty clear they were going to take a step forward, especially after they got DeBrincat. This offseason, just based on the fact that we are having a conversation about it going both ways, is why I come to the conclusion that I think that this team is going to either stay put or take a slight step back. And when I say take a slight step back, I don't mean 10 points go back to 80. I mean like fall to like 87, 88 points. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the rebuild is cooked. Red Wings fans who want to make, and I'm with you, leaving the season last year, I said, this next season has got to be the playoffs, or else I'm going to really lose patience with, the Yzerman, not really lose patience, but, start questioning the moves that have been made. But just because I said that doesn't mean that's what's going to happen. Because I'm looking at this team now and I say, I want this team to make the playoffs. I just don't see how this team, especially with the improvements to other teams, like the Washington Capitals going all in and getting a bunch of players to improve their roster for another, basically doing the Penguins and trying to make a final push for Ovi, right? The Ottawa Senators getting Linus Ullmark, who's going to be a huge upgrade in net for them. That was their biggest issue for a long time. Plus, new coaching and new general manager to maybe help clean up that mess, but that's a whole different topic. And the top 4 teams in the division aren't going anywhere. Boston's not going anywhere. Neither is Toronto, and Tampa's getting a little bit older, but they replaced Stamkos with Gensel and replaced Sergachev with McDonough, and I don't know if that's necessarily an upgrade, but to make room for these acquisitions, especially Gensel. So I find it hard to see the moves that the Red Wings made and having to bank on internal improvements that could work out. I'm not saying they won't, but they could work out, but just say with confidence that this team's going to be right back in it next year. I think that it's going to be another year where you just barely miss. And I understand because progress isn't linear, right? And I understand people are going to lose patience, and I'm going to be right there with them because of the fact that, like, you know, we do this for a living, Scotty, but we're also massive fans as well. So, like, I don't know.
That's
I
the
get
reoccurring.
it. I get the frustration. I just, at the same time, I think that this year, this roster is, I mean, swinging and missing on free agents, it sucks, but giving the youth the chance to play is what this team needs for the long term. Like, we have got to see the youth play, and this is just the year that it makes the most sense.
Yeah, no, and that's fair. I think that I think this team's around where they were last year. I think they're in a similar ballpark to what they were at last season. I think it's going to look a lot different, like we said, you know, better defensively, maybe slightly less goal scoring, but I think that that's fine. I think they'll be around the same, but it's interesting because, like, you can go, okay, well, what if they just don't go on a massive losing streak right around the trade deadline like they have each of the last 2 years, right? Like, what if they don't just completely implode at the deadline? Like, you talk about, I mean, just not spiraling out of control for, 3 weeks to a month every single year at the same spot, then you're talking about a playoff team. But in the same breath, you can go, okay, but what about the unsustainable, ridiculous goal scoring they got in the first couple of months of the season when they were, toward the top of the NHL? And obviously that wasn't sustainable either. So I think that you'll maybe see a lot less of like peaks and valleys and hopefully a more consistent product. But I think they're probably similar to where they were last season, which like you said, isn't awful and still puts them in the hunt and in kind of that, like playoff picture closing down to the end of the season. But there's still so many question marks surrounding this team is really my biggest takeaway. So many.
I mean, sorry, finish your
thought. No, that, like, we'll talk about it a lot more as we get closer and closer. Like, at the end of the day, this is a July conversation. Like, we'll see what the team looks like when we get closer to the season.
Yeah, and I just think that ultimately I want this team to make the playoffs, and we've been waiting for it this will be the 8th year if they don't make it, and I am right there with you in the impatience and the frustration. I've talked with friends, like, I'm so ready for this team to make it, but at the same time, I just can't see this roster as is being a playoff team unless everything goes right that we've talked about. I think what you're looking at is a small step backwards as a launch pad for a leap forward for a lot of these young guys once they become full-fledged NHL players, because unless Mazur or Casper win the Calder, I just don't see whatever. I'm getting really pessimistic and nihilistic, so we're going to end it there. We didn't even get to talk about the defense and the goaltending being wonky, but we've done that conversation before.
We kind of did.
We kind of did it last episode as well when we talked about how we don't know if Yzerman's really done because the construction of the defense and goaltending is weird. But we can also talk about that in the future because we're going to be here all July, 5 days a week, all throughout July. So we'll have plenty of time to talk about it. We're way over time. Scotty, final thoughts, brother.
We ball.
We'll be back with a new episode tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. Same time, same place. It's your team every day.
Every day.